Uh, It is a delight to meet in person a man I had the privilege of interviewing on a radio program that I host back in Washington. It's not as powerful as Jan's by any means, but it's a platform for talking with thoughtful, experienced, knowledgeable people like Zach Nunn about these critical issues day in and day out. I commend it to you. Secure Freedom Radio is the show. You can find it podcast at securefreedom.org. Zach, it turns out, is not only a state representative now here representing the people of the 30th District, he's also a man with very considerable experience in the national security arena, having served in the Air National Guard of Iowa, having deployed 3 times, racking up 700 combat hours as a pilot, not least having served on the National Security Council from, I believe, 2011 to 2013, in which time he served looking into these very questions of our vulnerability, particularly to cyber threats, but the resiliency of things like our electric grid. It is a distinct privilege to be able to say thank you to you all for putting a man like him into a position of hopefully increasing responsibility in your state legislature and possibly beyond. Zach Nunn, welcome. Good to have you with us.
Well, thank you very much this morning for coming out. And first of all, an appreciation to everybody who helped put this on. We have a number of national speakers who are coming to Iowa, who are having the opportunity to see what Iowans take as a priority. And the very fact that national security is coming to the forefront, and one of the things that we as the First in the Nation caucus state want to see, I think is very telling. Like was mentioned, I've had a great opportunity to grow up here in Iowa and spent the last 20 years seeing the world. I started off flying active duty with the Air Force as an intelligence officer, and then moved into the intelligence arena where I have had the opportunity to learn quite a bit. So today I'd like to talk about 3 specific things as we look at the security and some of the vulnerabilities to our electric grid, specifically in the realm of cybersecurity. And how I'm going to break up today's discussion is going to focus on those 3 things. The first, I'd like to identify the threat, what we know about cybersecurity, move into a couple of examples, and then talk about where we're going forward, both on the technological side as well as the policy side. When I first started out with the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, one of the first questions that we had was, where is the threat coming from, and what does that threat look like? I think for many of us who grew up in the 80s or earlier, we remember War Games, the movie where a young Matthew Broderick is typing away on his computer and all of a sudden has the ability to access the Department of Defense nuclear missile sites and could launch a theoretical nuclear attack on Russia. Today, the idea that a young man or woman sitting in their parents' basement is the biggest threat to the United States is almost a myth. The true reality is that we have a growing spectrum of threats to the United States and our critical infrastructure, included in that being our electric grid, our emergency responsibilities, as well as our water and purification, and the SCADA systems that keep our industry moving. On one end of the spectrum, we have a group of international terrorists. They're driven by an ideology, they are financed by a number of different actors, and they have a variety of capabilities, some of the very low-end threat, some at a very acute or high-end threat. At the other end of the spectrum, we have a group of nation-state sponsors who are actively seeking to infiltrate the United States. As my former commander, General Keith Alexander, the commander of U.S. Cyber Command and also the National Security Agency at the time, said when I joined him before the Senate Committee on Intelligence, there are 2 types of businesses in the world today here in the United States. There are those who know they have been attacked and those who don't know that they have been attacked. But I guarantee you, Senator, they have all been penetrated. So when we look at that spectrum of threat from the very low-level capability foreign threat actor to the very high-capability nation-state-backed threat sponsor, I'm going to focus today on the nation-state. We have seen a number of threat vectors come into the United States primarily focused on first intellectual property, what they can take away from our high-end businesses. The first people to wake up to this were those guys up on Wall Street, and the reason why, they had the most to lose from this, financially speaking. The groups who have been slower on the uptake or on the security have been those who are actually most vulnerable, that being our critical infrastructure. And so as you just heard in our last presentation on the vulnerability to our electric grid from an EMP assault, an attack on our electric sector by the things we use every day, our computers, our mobile devices, our smart cars, our smart pads, even the simple things like our cell phones, all play a role in opening up more vulnerability avenues of attack to our electric grid. So let me talk about three today, and I will say that I'm still an intelligence officer, so everything I'm going to talk about today is at the unclass level, and I hope that we have a good conversation afterwards, and if there's anything we can't talk about, we'll just keep it at the non-compromising level. I don't want to be a Mr. Snowden today. The one aspect of this that I think is very true is that we have a variety of nation-state actors and a varying capability of what that threat can be. So let me start with the one that I think is in the news most often, China. People's Republic of China has a cyber capability force that if you were to take the entire United States Army and join it with my alma mater, the United States Air Force, we'll throw in the U.S. Marine Corps for good measure, and the entire United States Navy as well as the Coast Guard and the entire Department of Homeland Security, you would still not number the total number of cyber operations officers that are currently working to attack the United States out of China. One of the largest, now granted, China is a large populous country, but they also have one of the largest groups of people actively working online to do a variety of things. My initial training was in counterespionage, and so human-enabled intelligence through simple things like Facebook are a great resource model. Why recruit a human asset to talk about what's happening in Washington, D.C., when they're already putting all that information out there on LinkedIn, in their Twitter account, in Facebook? And so one of the things we talk about with young officers is being able to maintain operational security when you're out in the environment, when you're actively recruiting, and also when you're actively defending U.S. interests. China has gone beyond just the traditional method of human intelligence collection. They are now actively seeking ingress routes to United States businesses, to United States intellectual property, and to United States critical infrastructure. To speak briefly to the criminal aspect of this, if you were to take the GDP of Ireland and combine it with the GDP of Hungary, and we'll also throw the GDP of Singapore all into one bucket together, that's how much money the United States lost just a year alone in theft, intellectual property theft, to foreign actors. And I won't call China out on the carpet because I think that's a position for the State Department and the Department of Defense and the President to do, and one that I hope as we continue in our pivot to China to be able to remedy. A second actor, North Korea. North Korea, to many of us, seems like a country that's constantly in the dark, quite literally, and in many ways it is. But it still had the capability and the wherewithal and the cyber prowess to be able to hire actors who were able to break into Sony Corporation for a second time. Many people don't realize that Sony's been penetrated multiple times, but for a second time by North Korea. From this, they were able to pilfer millions of dollars of intellectual property, to which Sony found itself flat-footed. And the United States, for the first time, was able to come back forcefully and put additional sanctions on the government of Pyongyang. Let's also look at an actor which has been a growing concern to the United States energy sector, what's happening in Tehran. Now, many of you will be familiar with the name Stuxnet. You might not necessarily know what it is, but what Stuxnet did is a highly developed virus that was planted through physical implementation through a thumb drive into a SCADA, or a control system, for Iran's nuclear reactors. Now, what it did was genius in its development. Just like a virus that we traditionally think of that can attack an immune system, it attacked the control system for Iran's nuclear reactors. And it did it by going after one specific target. It went after Cisco servers. Cisco servers so detailed, in fact, that they only were operational in Iran. Whoever, and I'll let you be the guess as to who it might have been, that developed this virus, was very concerned that this virus would not spread beyond its intended target, those Cisco routers within the government of Iran's nuclear program. Now, what this virus did is it basically overrode the SCADA system for controlling the nuclear reactors, fusion centers, and so it spun them out of control and ended up putting by most intelligence estimates, their ability to produce highly enriched uranium behind by 5 years, potentially longer. For a non-lethal, not in military terms we would use non-kinetic or military strike, That was a simple but brilliant way to push Tehran back to the Stone Age, or at least to the start of their nuclear program. Now, not in every way was it covered, but not a single loss of life occurred. The other part of this, which is the back end of the story that I think few people appreciate, Stuxnet virus infected 80% of Cisco servers of that make and model throughout the world. But you know what it didn't do? It didn't shut them down. It had the ability to determine who it was beaconing to, and I'm going to get into a little bit of technical here, but what SCADA system it was connected to. And if it wasn't that Iranian SCADA system or control system, those Cisco routers continued to operate just as normal. How brilliant. Let's fast forward 4 years. Let's see what the Iranians did in retaliation. Iran, having a smaller footprint and capability, but their threat actor looked at how could it best threaten Western interests, those in Western Europe, those in the United States, but specifically in its own backyard. What is the greatest source of revenue for Iran today? Oil. Who's its greatest competitor in the Middle East? Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Bahrain. Those are the countries that it chose to go after with a similar cyber attack. What it did in a country like Saudi Arabia is that it went after Saudi Aramco's control system. Now, it proved to be ineffective in stopping their oil production because it was too hard of a target. They'd been very good in their security apparatus. Do you know where they were lax? Their billing department. By simply shutting down their billing department and getting in there and corrupting the records and actually getting onto hard drives and destroying those machines, they put several thousand machines out of work. But most importantly, for anyone who owns a business or operates a business, they did not have the ability to know where their debt was and where their income was. It was a simple idea. But do you know it effectively shut down Saudi Aramco for almost 3 months for their oil production? Pretty impressive. Razgas. Razgas is a major oil corporation that many in the United States have never heard of, but it operates out of Qatar and Bahrain. And in a similar event, they went in and they destroyed, by using an infective virus through open means, through spearphishing, and we'll talk about some of the means here in a moment, but basically destroyed a number of hard drives in the Razgas operation. Again, for this, smaller than Saudi Aramco, but for this major oil producer in the Middle East, they were able to literally turn off the pipes of oil flowing out of the Persian Gulf. That's a targeted event. Where do we cross over from what is cyber espionage to corporate espionage to actually an active war? Well, let's look at the elephant in Europe, Russia. Russia has consistently been at the leading edge of using cyber as an instrument of national power. And what do I mean by that? For Russia, in Moscow, Vladimir Putin sees no difference between an economic embargo, a military or strategic strike, and the use of cyber. They should all be used interdependently in his mind. And he's used it to great effect. We first saw this in Estonia, a small country in the Baltic, where when the Estonian government said, we're going to get rid of this giant statue of Lenin in our town square because we're not a communist country, we've liberated ourselves from the Russians, and we don't want to be celebrating May 9th every day in our town square, the Russian minority population in Estonia protested. And as a result, a group of online hackers attacked the Estonian government, their web pages, simple defacement. So when you would type in estonia.es, their government website, it would show a waving Russian banner, and it would talk about how great Russia is and why they should keep it. What we didn't hear about is that in the initial response, there was the ability of government-backed hackers who broke into electric systems within Estonia and made their response to those capabilities much less effective. I don't know how many of you know anything about Russian history. I'm guessing there's a few in the room. But in 1918, when Lenin came to power and overthrew the Russian government, he didn't go after the military. He went after simple things like the telegraph center, the power plant, and the one electric grid in town. Guess what? He was able to overthrow the Tsar in a matter of 6 weeks. So as we look at some of the events coming up, the threat actors from Russia that we've seen in Georgia and even here in the recent event just a year ago in Ukraine continue to be disturbing, and here's why. The largest attack in the history of DDoS attacks came from Russia against Ukraine 1 year ago. And again, just like Lenin, they didn't go after the military apparatus or the individual Facebook plant. They went after Ukraine's ability to respond by taking out the electric grid, by delaying communications, and by destroying that command and control node that we have in the military to move forward. As a result, Russian separatists were able to move in. Ukraine, not to be outmatched, returned aggressively against Russia, also going after both their electric and oil grid at Gazprom. The disturbing part is that the majority of those attacks came from US-based servers, meaning that they're already in our system, they already have the ability to leverage us, and those DDoS attacks came out of Western Europe and the United States. The true irony being that the more connected a Western power is, not only the more vulnerable it becomes, but the more we become part of the problem. Our own systems, your grandma's, my cell phone, your neighbor's desktop computer are all being used as instruments for things like a DDoS, phishing, or aggressive attack. And am I running out of time here? Okay. At this point, I'd like to be able to talk a little bit more about the actual electric grid. But as far as for questions from the group, is there anybody who has questions on either the cybersecurity piece, what some of our threat actors are, or what some of our remediation tactics have been?
Know if our windmills that produce energy, being new, are protected against EMP?
Well, both against the EMP side, I would defer to the expert in the room, but no, generally, unless it is a military hardware design, there's very little in the United States that is designed to be withstanding of an EMP attack. Russians are actually one of the few countries that went forward after the Cold War and tried to harden most of their SCADA systems. What I will say, probably even more of a direct attack for our windmill system, is the fact that other countries have the ability, have the code, and have the access to be a threat to our wind energy as well as our solar energy. I'll tell an anecdotal piece of evidence. There was a group in China, a gentleman went over to work on a windmill, and the windmill that we see out here in northwest Iowa all the time needed a new piece of code. And so they were all the way up in the top of this giant wind-powered energy. As he went to go back down, his Chinese colleague and engineer said, "Oh, don't worry, I have that piece of code right here, let me pull it up for you. We'll insert it," and the windmill started turning. It was pretty impressive. But the engineer turned back to his colleague and said, "How in the world did you get our newest upgrade? We haven't even fielded it in our windmills here in the United States." "Oh, I don't know, it was given to me by the government." Lo and behold, when they came back, they realized that the Chinese government, I shouldn't say the Chinese government, that a Chinese associate had purchased these windmills and the code, but had already broken into that company's access point and was stealing their intellectual property the entire time. In fact, that company today in China now produces more windmills in China than anyone in the United States. That US company is currently out of business. Any other questions? Yeah. So please jump up if you have any questions or concerns. But as I was working at the White House, I worked as a nonpartisan member of the intelligence sector. What we attempted to do is identify that the idea of a government private sector solution can no longer be on the hand of just one or the responsibility of the other. It truly has to be a joint partnership. And so the first thing that we attempted to do is examine what voluntary measures could come forward from industry side. Because as much as the government likes to pretend they have all the solutions, they certainly don't have the remediation plan in place. And as much as the private sector has the technological capability, to be safe in one sector does not guarantee that you'll be safe in all sectors. And you only need one leaky hole in that ship for the entire thing to go down. So what we did is we passed Executive Order 13636, and what EO 13636 does is it brings together 500 of the leading businesses and say, hey, what are your best practices for cybersecurity and how do we disseminate that? We're also working with groups at the national and at the state level to say, hey, what are our integration centers seeing and how are we identifying in the intelligence community where that threat vector is that I talked about, and get that back out so the energy sector has the ability to put patches out there to identify threats from spear phishing. You know those emails where somebody sends you, hey, I've got $1 billion in Nigeria if you could just send me your credit card information. Well, imagine that for a major industrial complex. Hey, we'd like to do some integration with you if you could just share your access points for us so that we can do better integration. That works. Of the type of cyber threats that we're looking at, what we are most concerned about is not being able to stop all of them. And I think anyone who works in cyber or works in IT or works in systems recognizes that the growing sophistication and threat from a cyber actor is far too fast. What we have to really look at is resilience and reconstitution. And what I mean by that, being able to absorb a distributed denial of service attack or a hardware attack or a malicious attack of code, knowing what your systems have and either being able to triage, bifurcate that off and quarantine, or being able to say we can absorb that level of threat because we have other systems or redundancy systems throughout our networks. So, in the same way that we have looked at I'll use avian flu here in Iowa to be able to identify where we have threats and we've tried to quarantine, the same would be true of a network. How do we identify where those vulnerabilities are, defend where we can, knowing that eventually the threat will be able to penetrate that defense, and look at proactive ways to be resilient, to quarantine and terminate where necessary, but to be able to operate continuously when there is a very large attack like what we saw in Ukraine and Russia. All right. Yes, sir, in the yellow shirt.
Thank you for being here today. I'm wondering if they have the code for our windmill. Our son serves with the 1st Armored Brigade, a combat engineer.
Yeah.
And a lot of our military equipment is run obviously electronically.
Yeah.
We got to be at risk. Is that a fair assessment? I mean, I'm at a quandary here.
You hit the nail on the head. The challenge is, as we mentioned, a country which is connected as the United States is a huge advantage militarily, but we are also at a huge disadvantage. Trying to find a young airman or a young sailor or marine or soldier who went through life not knowing what it was like not to be connected and not being trained on a system that was already integrated, very difficult. I was very proud to see that the President and Congress have now identified, as well as my former boss, James Clapper, the Director of National Intelligence, the #1 threat to the United States beyond terrorism, beyond nuclear strike, is the threat of cyber on 3 fronts: economically, militarily, and also domestic security. No other threat hits all 3 of those targets. And that's been stated again and again in both State of the Union and by leadership coming out of both the Department of Defense and the intelligence communities. Now the question is, how do we better position ourselves to take on that 5 million man cyber force in an example like China?
Since you are in the Iowa legislature, I'm wondering what is being done to harden Iowa's grid, and are there any bills pending?
Yeah, no, very good. At the local level, I think that that's a relationship we've tried to develop with the state CIO. So the first piece of legislation we had going forward this year was to look at Connect Every Acre. I think that to continue to move Iowa forward in a connected status is probably the best thing that we can do. Talk about resiliency. Being able to have a network that has the ability to have multiple layers, highly advantageous if there ever were a threat. Now the one thing that comes with this is that we need to be able to have a partnership with Department of Homeland Security, that's our national level or federal oversight, the FCC, as well as what's happening with our private partners. And so like we did with the executive order, what we'd really like to be able to see is some of the best practices that are coming out of groups like Principal and Wells Fargo, as well as some of our locally grown security environments. How do we get that into what a lot of us think of as small businesses or farmers or groups like myself who maybe have under 20 employees? Well, some of the basic stuff could be change your industry password, being able to identify that you have a virus and getting it cleaned. Nobody wants to walk up to their grandma and say, hey, grandma, your computer is being used as a botnet attack against Ukraine right now. 1, we wouldn't believe it to be true. 2, we wouldn't have any idea how to solve it. So being able to be friends with your Geek Squad out of Best Buy is probably a good start. But in reality, the policy is what needs to catch up. Technology will always generally advance to a point where we'll be able to outmaneuver most threats. I appreciate it. Thank you so much for the opportunity today.